afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. It's just about noon, so we'll go ahead and get started as folks continue to come online today. My name is Carrie Riddle, and I'm the Deputy Director with the CINA Center, DHS Center of Excellence here at George Mason University, just outside of Washington, D.C. And we're very pleased to have you all joining us today for our speaker series, where we host a variety of subject matter experts to discuss topics related to CINA's research footprint, which is centered around approaches to better understand and disrupt criminal activities, and especially transnational organized crime. Just a quick reminder to please keep your microphones muted throughout the session today. And following today's talk, we'll have a Q&A session moderated by CINA's Interim Director, Dr. Rebecca Hirsch. So please feel free to type your questions in the chat at any point throughout the talk today. As we continue our lineup of fall events, I'd like to quickly highlight our next speaker series talk, which is on December 6th, featuring Rochelle Cahan from Collective Liberty, which is a nonprofit organization committed to supporting efforts to eliminate human trafficking. To learn more or register to attend the session and to see other news and upcoming events with the center, please visit our website, cina.gmu.edu. And this afternoon, it's a pleasure to welcome and introduce our speaker, Mr. Calvin Chrustie. Calvin is a former senior operations officer with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who oversaw one of Canada's largest federal investigative target teams. His 33 years of experience there included street crimes, national security, and homicide, but his later focus was twofold, including international kidnapping response and transnational organized crime operations. His last position was as the officer in charge of major projects, a target team tasked with taking on the highest level global threats to Canada that worked closely with the DEA, DHS, and other United States federal agencies to execute Canadian and U.S. cooperative operations. He has extensive operational experience targeting cartel, triad, and Iranian networks, including being the lead operations manager for cartel operations in Canada. And he was the first foreign police officer to be invited into the U.S. Attorney General exempt operations, leveraging covert financial operations with U.S. partners. He holds a Master's of Law with a major in dispute resolution, and his career accomplishments have been recognized through several awards, including being the first recipient of the International Policing Award from the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police in 2016 for his work in overseas kidnappings and transnational organized crime cases. Calvin is currently a partner in the global consulting firm, The Critical Risk Team, providing risk, security, intelligence, and crisis management services. And he is also one of the founders of Project Seshat, where he works with academia, security entities, and the private sector on building resiliency against foreign state threat activities, including transnational organized crime. Calvin is here to talk to us today about the threat landscape of transnational crime between Canada and the U.S. and share his unique perspective on the issues and challenges facing Canada, the U.S., and their other partners in addressing these complex types of threats. Calvin, we're very pleased to have you here, and we really appreciate you taking the time to share your insights with us today. And if you're ready, I'll hand the floor over to you.
Thank you very much. So probably one of the highlights of my career was working with American partners in terms of this space of transnational organized crime. So I always thought that I would love the opportunity to continue working with the American agencies and partners. I never did have that opportunity post my career, which ended 4 or 5 years in law enforcement. And from what I gather, I always had a exceptional relationship with my American partners and international partners, and I kind of gather sometimes it's not as good as it used to be for a number of different reasons. So I'm hoping what I can do today is not only share some of my insights from a Canadian perspective in terms of the threat landscape, but also talk about some of the obvious challenges and difficulties and impediments sometimes that U.S. agencies may have working with Canadian entities, because I think it's something that, from my own experience, whenever there was discussions about them, there was always a degree of emotion at the table, a little bit of fear, in terms of bureaucratic organizations, hesitant to say anything in these diplomatic kind of context. I'm hoping today that there won't be any filters, at least on my side, and I hope not on your side in terms of asking questions and sharing thoughts during the interactive. So I'll talk about the threat landscapes, and then I'll get into some of those impediments and challenges that I think are really relevant. All the information is open source because I'm under different obligations from my previous security clearance. However, I've always been kind of the opinion that most of it can be reconstructed in terms of OSINT. And my experience probably is different than many other Canadian law enforcement because I had not only access to significant human capability, because I used to be the intelligence operations officer prior to going into transnational organized crime, but I also, because of that role in kidnapping, that's why I highlighted it in my bio, I did a lot of overseas works with military organizations and agencies and intelligence agencies globally, which allowed me to have different access, inclusive of SIGIT information, high side information, or however you use it. And I'm presuming everybody knows what that is. That's your NSA RCSE. And obviously unable to disclose that, but I've tried to recreate it in open source discussions. I highlight this one as, hey, what are the threats in Canada? And I really want to emphasize what are the threats to the world from Canada, because my experience working with US entities and global ones is I don't think they have always a clear understanding of the significance of the threats that we pose. But the talk today, I'm going to be looking at highlighting in a way that illuminates some of the serious threats that we have here and that pose a threat to our neighbors to the south and to our other allies and partners. I did a talk, and the talk was called, Is There an Iceberg? And I was asked to do it at the business school at the University of British Columbia here in Vancouver. The day that I did the talk, it was in the evening at a large center. It's where when the Dalai Lama comes, he speaks. They were obviously desperate, asked me to speak. So I spoke and I did this presentation. But that day that I did it, I got a phone call from our national headquarters, which I often did, asking, why are you doing that talk? The role of our agency is to investigate and enforce, not for public education. I was a little perplexed by it, as my recollection of my basic training and my studies at university in terms of the principles of policing, where public awareness and education is extremely important. And what I did there in that discussion, I highlighted some of the things that I'm highlighting in this discussion in terms of concepts of awareness and ringing the alarm bell in terms of, is there an iceberg? All I would suggest is the iceberg that existed then, I think we've hit it up here, and I don't know if the Americans understand the significance of the iceberg to the north versus the threat to the south. Most of the predictions / concerns that I had that Ottawa was concerned I was going to illuminate back then are similar ones I'm going to illuminate today, and I think they're still as equally real and of concern. And when I look at, say, for example, US media reports and other reports, and when I participate on LinkedIn and I see posts about threats, I truly do get the sense that there's a lack of clear understanding of the acute threats posed in Canada to the US. And I used to say, and I still say sometimes, well, the US has bigger and better football teams and basketball teams, et cetera, et cetera. I wouldn't be so confident when it comes down to transnational organized crime threats and networks. I give you credit for football and for basketball, but I think we're on par in terms of the networks we bring, and I'll go through some of these networks with you. The reasons why some of the serious threats come from Canada is, number one, we see ourselves as a convergence zone, particularly Vancouver and Toronto. Perhaps there'll be a little more illumination in recent months coming ahead on Montreal because of the Middle Eastern population there in terms of what activities may impact world security, but not too sure that we've looked in that area that much. But the convergence zones, Vancouver and Toronto, definitely for sure. And the other areas, sometimes the East Coast of Canada, but definitely Vancouver, definitely Toronto, Toronto being the financial center of Canada. Also, safe zone. Our insights historically over the last decade plus is that crime networks feel extremely safe here. Twofold, probably, or maybe threefold. One, which I'll get into a little more, cultural nuances relative to security, national security. Sadly, and somewhat embarrassingly, we've relied extensively on the US for that. Thus, our public hasn't had that much to worry about as a result of the significant assistance and support that's not well understood in Canada in terms of the work that you do in terms of mitigating the threats coming from the south, particularly towards us, and mitigating them globally as well. Because if they're hitting Canada, they're often hitting the US, and the capacity, reach, et cetera, allows for a lot of mitigation there. So there's a culture of complacency, I would suggest, in Canada that contributes to it being a safe zone. The second aspect, which I'll talk about more, the legal framework. I won't get into it, but to say our legal framework is effective, I would say probably would be an understatement, and I would probably, instead of using the word effective, I would probably use the word dysfunctional. Maybe not so much when it comes down to domestic threats, i.e. homicides and some of the other criminal activities, but when it comes down to global threats, the framework that we have is very incongruent with our partner agencies and allies around the world. Number three is we have a strong diaspora community of populations that have strong relationships with foreign states that are our adversaries. I put the four obvious ones there. We don't have significant connectivity in terms of our diasporic populations with Korea. We do in terms of Iran, huge. Russia, so-so, but China, significant. Interconnectivity, both commercially and in the general population. So there's a lot of ties there, and we see relationships between these entities operating here and connected to the transnational organized crime networks and their activities. So I did this slide years ago. I was going to change it when I was preparing for this, but one of the things organizationally that we look at it is, transnational organized crime, is looked at by policing in terms of the TOC stuff on the left with like a separate organization, which poses a bit of a threat and a challenge, which I'll talk about more in terms of structural challenges. Cyber, we're not that well advanced, not compared to the US, in terms of our capabilities within policing to respond to cyber. I would say we're in a very childlike state. I wouldn't say adolescent even. And then on the state infiltration and influence, which is our security, our Canadian Security and Intelligence Service, I would say because of their focus historically on counterterrorism, only recently, which I would attribute a lot of the reason for it, a shift to look at moving away from counterterrorism to the inclusivity of transnational organized crime threats. Now, I don't think officially they'll even look at them, but they are looking more at the foreign threats. And sadly, from a Canadian perspective, what I see is they don't understand the interconnectivity of transnational organized crime, counterterrorism, cyber, and all the other activities, corruption, etc. But I'll talk about those later. Then you look at the policing structure in Canada. The reality is we do not have, this would upset my peers and my organization, we don't really have a true federal law enforcement organization. We have a national police, but the vast majority of the police entities in there are municipal, like city, and or provincial, i.e. state. Only a small percent of those are federal resources and tasked with federal mandates. But the compromising factor in terms of how that impacts everybody is that most of the focus then becomes on street crimes, i.e. drug addiction, gangs, and prostitution, those type of activities. Underneath that activity, which I don't think is well understood in the senior policing community in Canada, is the interconnectivity of all the activities down below. And usually that's because most of the strategic approaches and managerial focuses and leadership focus has always been on the imminent, because the imminent is the ones that drive the politicians, and the structures in Canada and policing basically perpetuate and facilitate that somewhat non-strategic approach or comprehensive understanding of the more significant threats that are under the waterline, that are not as visible and are a little more complex and subtle to understand. One thing that I share, and there is reference to it, I'm a director and founder of Project CSHAT, which is this global NGO focused at hybrid warfare and countering it. We've just developed a partnership with NATO. We're just going through a name change to be the Council on Countering Hybrid Warfare. And I'm presuming, and I don't have that visibility back and forth to see everybody here, so I'll presume everybody has some familiarity with the term hybrid warfare. In Canada, most don't. The reason that we created this NGO, which I think is really relevant to the Canadian landscape, was what I saw historically was the interconnectivity that I talked about of all these different threat activities, from organized crime, corruption, terrorism, political interference, illicit finance, insider threats, cyber, lawfare, and misinformation, disinformation, and the whole networks relative to foreign state activities in Canada. And a lot of the organized crime activities that I started seeing in 2008, 2009, when I was the Intel Ops officer for BC, reinforced this diagram that you're seeing, particularly the inclusion of foreign state activity in transnational organized crime activities. And I'll talk about that a little more. Probably in 2010, when I started working with the Attorney General exempt operations, with HSI, with the DA, FBI, AFP, because we were kind of working that north-south nexus from Colombia, Mexico, US, and then also to Australia, which I believe at that time, Australia, we were ranked one of the top threats to Australia, Canada, in terms of organized crime threats. And if you do a little open source research, you'll see some cases in some of the networks that were prominent at that time. They included Middle Eastern networks, Chinese-based networks that were operating in Canada, targeting Australia. But what we noticed here was, and this is obviously when I started getting exposed a lot to cartel operations, we saw this corporate infrastructure, which I'm sure if you've worked cartels and others, that you would notice a similar structure in terms of like corporately. There was maybe three aspects of it that were really, maybe four aspects of it actually, the non-blue, that were really interesting, that seemed different. Our American entities were surprised when they were working here. And my office, like next to my office, was the DA. On the other side of my office was the HSI. It was a very unique relationship we had with them. They were embedded. They weren't, we give them offices. We try to get them out of the consulate and being, employed in our day-to-day activities, et cetera, et cetera. So they had like really good visibility, and we had really good visibility both ways. But one of the things that we saw was in 2010, the white box there, 2009, a phenomena that took on the name Project Scrapyard. And basically what it was a surge in gang violence across Canada, starting in Vancouver and then going across the country. What was interesting on this stuff was that the leaders had strong Middle Eastern connectivity, specifically Iranian and or Iraqi Kurd activity, i.e. those that were previously trained by the US military, those networks. And congruent with the largest money laundering case in the world, the HSBC case, we started seeing, the Sinaloa cartel and the alliance with the Iranian networks, particularly in Vancouver. But the gang violence was driven by these, and I'd say we probably had 3 kingpins in the Vancouver area. Both were exterminated within probably 3 to 4 months, I think, roughly, of each other by this network. Then this network eventually, and there's a book written about it, Wolfpack, and I remember raising the concern going, there's this new group called the Wolfpack that's behind all this stuff. At that time, there was another group called the UN, and which was prominent, big, large, globally, multi-ethnic gang organization, dealing with in the tonnage and hundreds of keys of product, etc. But this new group seemed to have a more acute structure relative to Iranian networks, and we were picking up indicators of national security interconnectivity. Then what we also noticed, in addition to this unique strategic approach to eliminate our kingpins in Canada by the Iranian networks, we started seeing an interesting surge in visibility, maybe because we're looking, not too sure, in terms of illicit financial activity that was happening in Canada with the Iranian networks and with the movement of money that we were engaged in facilitating and monitoring. Then we started seeing, in the early 2010, 11, 12, we started seeing, and I don't know if it was because we were looking more and working in this space more, but what we started seeing was the upper echelon players connected to particularly Mexican cartels, but the odd Colombian ones. And it was those, we probably had 8 to 9 different cartels that were coming and going into Vancouver. The Sinaloa was definitely the most dominant ones, but the others were operating up here, coming and going. We had some of the Colombian associates coming up here. We had a lot of family members from the most senior, like the C-suite executives, that were living up here or traveling up here on a regular basis. So every couple of weeks, we would get a phone call saying, hey, the wife and children of blah, blah, blah are coming up there for a week, or hey, they're living down the street. We found out they're living there possibly. Can you confirm they're living there, et cetera, et cetera. So we started seeing increasing presence. So with the surge of the Iranian gang extermination, we then saw this backfill of the cartel coming in, congruent with the HSBC money laundering case and what, the findings was there. So but basically what I was seeing was the whole HSBC, the whole convergence, between the Mexican cartels and the Iranian networks was taking place in Canada and taking over organized crime at the top level on that. Now, bearing in mind, at that time, the person that was driving intelligence operations in Canada was a guy named Cameron Ortez. And Cameron Ortez, who's on the front page of our papers every day here, and some of your papers, later ended up being the head of Canadian intelligence for the RCMP. in court testimony in the last couple of weeks, it's been disclosed that he was working with the Iranian networks in Canada. So when I look at why we weren't successful, why we had impediments, and that, I don't know how far back that goes, but the allegations are he was working with the top ones in Canada and globally, including trying to reach out to Kahani and other networks that are notorious global networks in Middle Eastern finance and terrorist financing and transnational organized operations. So those are three kind of really interesting dynamics in terms of the structures that were taking place. Was, hey, there's this really robust, violent security component to the transnational networks that appeared to be driven by the Iranian networks. Increase in the financial activity we were seeing, the control and command of what was taking place in Mexico and Colombia seemed to be having a more presence, particularly in Vancouver and Toronto. But the most interesting one is the yellow box communication cells, BlackBerries. So if you looked at open source, you would find that probably at least through open source, there's 4, if not 5, of the world's most prominent encryption companies that were facilitating secure communication for the cartels, for the Iranians, and for global transnational networks that are conversations that presidents of countries, prime ministers of countries in Europe are talking about. And if one does a little drilling down, the vast majority of those are probably within 10 to 15 kilometers where I'm talking today. They are not in Los Angeles. They are not in New York. They are not in Paris. They are not in London. They are not in Sydney. They are not in China. They are here in Vancouver. Thus, I go, hey, for everybody that says, which I hear all the time, oh, no, London's the same as Vancouver in terms of money laundering. Okay, well, how come you didn't have a whole infrastructure of the world's encryption companies? And why do we have them? I'll get into that in the next slides. Why do I think they were here? Here's a map from BC Insider, and this is what we saw with the cartel activity. 20% of our operations had a connectivity to Chicago, probably 70% to Los Angeles. We had lots to Arizona as well, where the cartels were. But that's what we saw, like LA, and then Nogales for a little bit when Guzman was really active out of Arizona. Vancouver was one of the key hubs, as well as Toronto. But one of the things to pay attention to if you're in this profession is notice that there was always a perception with American entities that Canadians like good quality cocaine. I don't think we do like good quality cocaine, not that I would know, but I think it was a misanalysis. The reason we always get good quality cocaine, also known as high heat, being imported to Canada, we later learned the reason why. For those that do know, maybe some don't know, our convergence centers up here would always ask for it, and then part of the business model was then to step on it before it got shipped over to the Asian Pacific clients. So that from a costing perspective, if somebody brought in 95% cocaine into Vancouver, they would be able to step on it for costing and take their 10% of the cocaine off, still be 85%, so still not bad quality, send it to Australia, to the Philippines, or wherever else it was going, and clients would still be happy. So that's, a lot of people, at least when I got into it, everybody thought that Canadian people were a little more finicky on their cocaine, but it was part of the business model in terms of financing the transportation and distribution networks in Canada. Why are we a transshipment center? I'd say the corporate expansion of transnational organized crime into China and with China. is one of them. We have, particularly in Vancouver and Toronto, a very strong business network and industry connected to China historically. I would say, for the most part, our economy and financial system, unfortunately, coincidentally, our political system has been closely tied to China, which has made life very challenging in the last year or two in terms of dealing with some of the national security concerns that we have in Canada and that are shared by the US. Our versus Stinchcombe, a court case for anybody in operations, and that is probably the nightmare court case in Canada that came out of our Charter of Rights, which are our constitution, renewed constitution in the early 80s. And it's a disclosure law that puts huge emphasis on having to disclose all types of information beyond what I would suggest is reasonable and incongruent with most of our partners' disclosure requirements, which makes it very difficult for us to work with foreign entities and poses a significant risk, I think, to our own national security. The Financial Action Task Force, even though it gives us high ratings, there's some significant gaps there. And one of the biggest gaps is it gives us significant positive ratings, which then perpetuate the politicians, the bureaucracies, our security and intelligence institutions to pay attention to where they should. And what they do is they look at different laws that we have, and it's on a metrics with other states, and they look at it and they go, hey, you get points for this, you get points for this law, you get points for this law. We have all those laws. But when you take the overarching template of VAR versus Stinchcombe, they basically neutralize all those laws anyway. So you can have all those laws, but if your court proceedings and processes are compromised with R versus Stinchcombe, all those other laws become irrelevant. Vancouver's the first largest port in Canada, the fourth in North America. LA, Long Beach, and New York are number 1, 2, 3. Before that, most don't realize that we're that big of a port. The diaspora communities in this port region, Iranian and Chinese, are significant, and there is close historic relationships with these entities historically in the Vancouver area for the last decade plus or so. Our laws, our structures, unlike the US, make it almost impossible to leverage electronic intelligence from our national security entities. And even in terms of wiretap capabilities, the requirements are extremely burdened, but we also do have, coupled with that, we have historically been probably the capital of encryption companies in the world. Just a couple examples. Wiretap case is going back quite a while, like I think maybe 10 years ago, but it just shows you the threat and where people weren't looking at it. And coincidentally, at the time this threat came through was the time that Cameron Ortez, the guy before the courts here that's alleged to be working with Iranian networks, had significant influence. So this has Mohammed Tarabi, who's a well-known Iranian transnational organized crime figure. He gets picked up on a wiretap, and he's talking to all the Italian entities and all the Hells Angels and saying, hey, if you need anything going through the Vancouver port, just let me know. I have access to the whole port. When you look at the business model in terms of the port and why we're seeing everybody out of the Netflix series Narcos visit here historically, because when we're doing, picking up coke, in our different covert operations at 1,000 to 2,000 a kilo of coke, and I should say 2,000 kilo because we're talking Canadian dollars, and you look at how that moves up the coast, and then going over to the, as soon as we move that dope from Vancouver to Australia, which we were doing a lot of, you can see 60,000 to 240,000 to $250,000 for a brick of coke. And then you can see the other prices for the Asia Pacific. So you can see from a transshipping perspective where all the money is made, and then you add stepping on the high heat coke, you can see why the business model is so profitable and why people like Chapo Guzman had his family move up and others hang out, and why even Chapo Guzman had a strong interest in living in the Vancouver, BC area at some point. There's just the model. In terms of it, we had a money laundering inquiry called the Cullen Commission about 3 or 4 years ago because of the concerns from the community and industry. I would say they just didn't understand the magnitude of it. There's a lot of cognitive dissonance, twofold. One was the cognitive dissonance that people in Ottawa, which I say is the equivalent of Dublin in Europe, had a difficult time understanding what was happening in places like Vancouver, i.e. Istanbul, because the distance is about the same. It seems when I use that analogy, it resonates a little easier with people in terms of understanding, if it's a European context, why it would be difficult for Dublin to understand there. But that has been my historic experience, that Ottawa struggles with understanding the complexities as to what was happening here. In fact, I remember writing reports that were evidentiary based. They would get dismissed saying that's not possible. One in particular, we said we had one guy bringing in 92 metric tons of precursors annually a year. Some of it was in the tonnage range, likely the use of fentanyl. They were like, there's no way. Meanwhile, we had all the documentations to support it. It wasn't a theory, it was evidentiary stuff, and people were saying that we were exaggerating the report. So cognitive dissonance, and then on the flip side of it, a conflict of interest, perhaps not wanting to acknowledge the significance of the threat, meaning that they would have to do significant things to resolve the problem if they identified there was a problem. So here's what we see here in terms of the nexus. Probably in 2015, and again, it's reconstructed in open source, and I hate to break the hearts of the Americans again. I was in the room with all the international partners when the Colombians, and I testified to this, when the Colombians and the Americans were sitting in the room at the most senior level in the US. When I was in Miami, and we had people from Washington, D.C., and the senior Colombian people said to me, or the Americans did, they wanted to facilitate a conversation saying, we have an unprecedented threat that we'd like you to meet with the Colombians on. We've never seen magnitude of financial cash transactions like this ever. And it has a very unique characteristic that we've never seen in terms of the volume of the money and in terms of the language that they were picking up in the operations. The language was Mandarin Cantonese, and the location was area code 604. Now I see almost every article I read and every post on social media is, the fentanyl was US and China and cartels. I hate to break everybody's hearts, but I had all the Americans working in my office. I was at all the meetings with the Colombians in terms of the money movement. That nexus, one of the main origins of that nexus was Vancouver. And I say that not with pride, but just to ensure that people understand the significant threat actors that are up here. And that whole fentanyl crisis kind of then spread from there out. We spent a lot of time in Washington, D.C., sending teams back and forth to share information on the beginning of the fentanyl epidemic, where it began coming through the Postal Service here in Vancouver. That's kind of what we see in terms of the money movements up, north-south for repatriation of funds, historically to back and forth between here and Asia, and then back and forth to Dubai, Iran. That's basically what we see. Lots of bulk cash ops historically. I'm out of it for a couple of years, so I don't know. The casinos were a huge problem. We ended up hitting them and turned into a major national controversy where the triads were using the casinos to go through real estate for all those networks, trade-based money laundering. I don't think it's been really well looked at. Money service businesses were. We raised them in 2007. Everybody kind of dismissed them, i.e. Ottawa had, until the Five Eyes raised the concern regarding Mr. Kahani. And then we started looking at them again here. And then there's the trial that's taking place in Ottawa currently regarding somebody that was collaborating with those same networks in Canada and abroad. Are there kingpins here? I kind of alluded to that. The Guzman network was extremely prevalent here, but we saw a lot of other entities up here as well. That's at top, I think it's on your left, the map, the insider one that I already showed. Moving over to the right side of the screen, if I've got it right, is the heroin distribution historical one. And that was a network that HSI, we worked with HSI quite closely with, and DA on, and that was the SCUBA network, also known as, I think his name was, I think Hassan was the last name, or Hassam. He was a Tanzanian-based entity, and at that time believed to be moving about 25% of the world heroin out of Afghanistan through Tanzania to South America, back to Europe and through North America. Something that's not well known was he had Canadian operations. His wife was living in Canada, and he was looking at moving to Canada. But we had networks there, and we worked intimately running operations back to Europe and back into Africa, and our military was involved in operations with the other alliances, taking off shipments off the Horn of Africa. But he was looking at moving, I can't remember if it was Montreal or Toronto. There was word years ago, I think it's public knowledge, but when DHS was working them with FBI, DEA, we ended up working closely, particularly with the Nogales operation targeting them. We were engaged in undercover operations there, which was part of the New York court case, so it's all in public record. But one of the challenges in that case that took place, from our understanding, was that most of the wiretap intercepts were at the corporate level, and there wasn't a lot of criminal activity being picked up or identified in the wiretaps. Chapo Guzman sent his godson up to Vancouver to run Canadian operations, and there was a cell also back in Toronto, and they were running their operations there for their redistribution to Asia out of here, and as well as supply up here. That seizure there for 1,001 keys was, again, I believe it was Sinaloa and Iranian networks, that particular seizure. Fentanyl, kind of talked about that. Major problems in Canada, just like the US. I think the percentage is about the same. Historically, we were producing fentanyl. I just saw there was a lab just taken down 2 days ago here in Canada. At the beginning, we were bringing in precursors at the tonnage for the production here, and we had networks to produce it. The first production, I think, in North America, I think in 2012 or 13, first lab ever was in Vancouver. I think, yes, it shifted to Mexico, and I'm sensing most of it's there, but we just took a lab down here, and historically there's been production up here and a lot of shipment of other synthetics down south as well. I'm just going to go through. I already talked about the senior intel officer in Canada that was working with Iranian networks, which I think probably, in addition to the encryption problems that were posed in terms of challenges for international law enforcement in Canada, I don't know the impact this has, but I do know, working with the Americans, there was a lot of operations that seemed to go awry and strange, including the one on Chapo Guzman, where we were having dinners with his son on a regular basis for months and had a great relationship with him. And then one day, just up, packed, left, disappeared. We suspect we got compromised, and several years later we find out that, well, there's this case going on, as I alluded to. We saw lots of interesting relationships between the Chinese networks, the Iranian ones, and the cartels, and we would get indicators, I'll use it, of national security entities like Hezbollah, state agencies from Iran that would show up in our operations periodically. The testimony last week, and I'm not telling any big secrets, was the testimony from kind of the key unit at that time, which was called Operational Research Branch. One of the main analysts said he didn't always enjoy working organized crime files, and he preferred national security files, which I think portrays a bureaucratic mindset of how these networks work. coming from our headquarters. And I don't mean that to be overly critical, but I share it to be transparent because I'm concerned about it. So in terms of proper analysis, we're producers and exporters, not just consumers. We do have kingpins here, not just lower levels. If I look at what, my work with Seattle, my work with San Francisco and other US entities, I would put the significant of Vancouver comparable to LA, even though the population's slower. We don't have as much street usage and just regional distribution there. But in terms of higher level organized crime representation here historically, we've had that similar type, vice president level type entities here, including, I'm going to get it wrong, T-Lop Chai or Chai Lop C or whatever it is, who's the big synthetic guy from China, used to live here, used to live in Toronto, and is considered the biggest synthetic guy for the Chinese triads, and his start was here as well. If you're seeing that we have all these great laws through the Financial Action Task Force, I'd say false. We do have a bunch of laws, but they basically get watered down through the Stinchcomb law, which nobody likes to talk about here. The only ones that accept and acknowledge it are police. And I think the NS threats historically are huge as a result of the encryption bases that have been here historically. The challenges moving forward in terms of working in Canada, cognitive dissonance. I think Canadians just don't have that national security lens that the Americans have or other entities around the world have. We've been very fortunate in our own security thanks to our neighbors to the south. I don't know if people recognize that. So cognitive dissonance, understanding the threats and accepting the threats is a big challenge. Conflict of interest, we are embedded with China corporately and politically, and that makes it very difficult, with the triads and synthetics and others, to tackle these threats, talk about them openly, and particularly talk about the interconnectivity between the transnational organized crime threats to the corruption, to the illicit finance, the connectivity to the state, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Third challenge, the structures. Talked a little bit about it, we have a national police. We do have a federal police entity to it, but if you look at the overarching governing structure, you'll find that the executive committee is dominated by provincially paid states, and the organized crime targeting processes are very much influenced by municipal and provincial entities. And my own experience was it was kind of garbage in, garbage out. We got so much stuff from the street in terms of our collection process that it kind of watered down the intelligence assessments and analysis and the targeting process, where I tried to sidestep that and just focus on what our international partners were, but it was always a struggle because of the bureaucratic structures there. And then I'd say our organizations, because of Stinchcomb and some of the other laws, don't share and don't work together that well. And I know Americans have, some challenges, but here I would say they're more acute because of our disclosure laws and our culture and the cognitive dissonance and all the other stuff that comes into play, and the geography of our country as well. And I've already talked about the legal framework of Stinchcomb, which is basically makes our legal process completely dysfunctional. What do I think where the risk and threats are? I think they're going up higher. I also think that these risks aren't just to Canadians, but when I look at historically, retrospectively, if you think you have a problem south of the border, there's a reason why they're north of the border too. And it isn't just for operating purposes, but probably for other national security interests to position themselves here.